Welcome to the webinar. You have entered an...
Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar. We'll just wait a brief 10 seconds to get everybody in the room, but great to have everybody join us. And yeah, so hello and welcome to New Energy Update's latest webinar covering public and privately procured renewables in the Middle East and North Africa. My name's Reese Watts and I'll be acting as the host for the webinar. And I'm happy to say that we've had over 700 of you signed up today. So thanks very much for the great response, and thanks in advance to the panelists for their time. So just a quick one from me. The webinar is going to last roughly 60 minutes and will be recorded. So we'll send across the full audio recordings and presentations to participants in the following week. And as you may know already, we're running this webinar in conjunction with our upcoming Leading Strategic event in Dubai, which is on the 26th and 27th of March, which MENA New Energy. And it's a pleasure to have Evershed Sutherland as a strategic partner working with us to create the forum for discussions with key stakeholders around renewable energy project development. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ewan Walters, partner at Evershed Sutherland, who will be leading the webinar today. And alongside him, we have two expert panelists, Brendan Cronin, the Head of Management Consulting at Procured, Jean-Pascal Boutin, partner at Evershed Sutherland. And if you have any questions at any point for the panelists, just simply enter this into the text box and we'll get across to them throughout. So without further ado, I'd like to move to our first panelist, Ewan. Over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ewan Walters. I'm a partner with Evershed Sutherland, and I head up the clean energy team for the MENA region for Evershed Sutherland. I will give a brief overview of where we are with the clean energy programs that have been procured in 10 jurisdictions in MENA. I'll spend about 10 or 15 minutes going through the existing position. I'll then hand over to Brendan Cronin, who's the Head of Management Consulting for the Middle East at Procured. And Brendan will talk us through the business case for private PPAs globally, and including in the MENA, and the growing incentives for savings for customers to turn to and look at using private PPAs, especially in MENA. And then we'll finish with a partner of mine at Evershed Sutherland. His name is Jean-Pascal Boutin. He heads up our global regulatory team and looks at all of the private PPA work that we complete globally. And he's done a significant amount of work on private PPAs in the MENA region. So without further delay, I'll move on to the first section of this webinar, which is to focus on the renewable procurement projects in MENA. In specific, we will look at the following jurisdictions listed there on your slide. And just to reiterate, this is the public procured projects in MENA. It doesn't, unfortunately, cover any of the private PPA projects that have been put in place. And it doesn't include any projects, therefore, that have not been reported in a public manner. So some of the rooftop solar projects that are in place and are installed in some of these jurisdictions won't be captured in the information. But hopefully the information that we'll run through will give you an overview of where we are with the renewable energy program in these regions. We're going to try and run a poll that Reese is going to run, so that we're going to ask everybody that's listening to the webinar to vote to see which of these jurisdictions that are showing on the slide are currently producing the highest amount of installed renewable energy. And we'll give you the results of that at the end of this session. So we're hoping that the poll works. So if you could open the poll and cast your vote. And again, the purpose of the poll is to list the jurisdiction with the highest amount of installed clean energy at the moment. And then we'll give you the answer at the end of this program. So without further ado, we'll run through these jurisdictions now at a high level to let you know what's currently installed in those jurisdictions and what is planned from a public procurement perspective for clean energy in these regions. So we'll start with Algeria, and there's some background information there about Algeria, including the overall installed renewable capacity of just over 600 megawatts, and then broken down with the PV capacity. And then we have broken the information down for Algeria so that we cover the solar PV projects that have already been procured in Algeria, together with the wind projects. As you can see, like many of the jurisdictions that we're going to cover, there are more solar PV projects than there are wind projects. We'll then turn to the next slide on Algeria, which actually sets out which projects are under procurement. And as you can see, there is one solar project under procurement and no wind projects. And then finally, we look at the up and coming projects for Algeria. And we've set out there the announced date for those projects. So there are targets in place for 2030 for wind and for solar. And we're expecting those tenders for those future projects to be run in the period between now and 2030 to enable those targets to be met. So that's the position with Algeria, and we'll follow the same format now, and we'll run through each of the other jurisdictions. As Reece said, if you do have questions about any of the information that we've provided about the various jurisdictions, please do let us know either during the webinar or at the end of the webinar. As you can see in Egypt, there's a much higher installed renewable energy capacity, and most of that is in the solar area. So as you can see from the projects that are currently being procured, there is a wind program in place already, which is a feed-in tariff wind program. And at the moment, there is the West Nile project that's currently being procured in Egypt. There's been a huge amount of work done already in Egypt, as many of you will know, including on the Benban project. So that's over 1 gigawatt of projects that have been procured in Egypt. The second project there listed under procured projects is in fact a private PPA, which is of 14 gigawatts that was recently announced in the press. So that's an interesting development. But the main program that most people will be aware of is the Benban solar park that Evershed Sutherland, together with many others that are listening to this webinar, worked on last year and are continuing to work on, and that's been hugely successful. And then finally, for Egypt, we have the up and coming projects, and there are extremely high targets set in place for solar for 2035, and again for wind by a significant amount, so 20 gigawatts of additional capacity of wind to come in Egypt. Well, that's what's been announced, so hopefully the regime can help the developers meet that demand. Moving on then to Jordan, there's a very high installed renewable capacity in place already for Jordan. That's as a result of the first 2 rounds of renewable energy programs that have taken place in Jordan. There was a very recent announcement that was made by the Council of Ministers in Jordan, and that was that all new electricity projects above 1 megawatts are going to be put on hold until they finalize their plan for projects later this year. So the round 3 projects will go ahead, but anything else in addition to the round 3 projects that are already in progress will need to wait until the government to finalize their plans later this year. If we then turn to the currently procured projects, as I say, what's currently being procured is the round 3 projects, and what's been procured, and then what's being procured, then the procured projects is set out there in the table underneath for Jordan. So Jordan's had a very successful history of clean energy in a mix of wind and solar, and it's pushing ahead with the 3rd round of the program that is already run in Jordan. Turning to Kuwait then, as you can see, there's no installed renewable capacity from publicly procured projects. What's in place in Kuwait at the moment are projects that are currently being procured, including the Dibdiba solar project, which is a gigawatt that's been highly anticipated, and that's been discussed and announced for a while now, so everybody's waiting for further details there. And then you can see the other projects listed on the screen there. Those are the ones that are currently being procured in Kuwait. We then turn to Morocco, which has a high installed renewable capacity of just under 3 gigawatt, and that is a mix of solar and wind projects, because there are extremely windy sites in Morocco for their projects, and there are also large solar projects in Morocco, and a number of those are CSP projects, so they've been very successful in developing their CSP technology. There are then projects that are currently being procured. There's a solar project and a wind project, and then there are announcements made for up and coming projects for Morocco, as you can see on the slide in the solar sector, for 200 megawatts and 800 megawatts. If we then turn to Oman, the amount installed from publicly procured projects is not significant at this point in time, but there is a huge public procurement in progress for their up and coming projects. So there's already IBRI 2, which is already in play and very developed. What they've announced now in Oman is that IBRI 3 will also be commencing, and that's again between 500 megawatts to a gigawatt in size. They've then, there are additional projects being procured at the moment, and then they've also announced that they will be running further solar projects and wind projects in 2022, 2023, and again there'll be an additional wind project coming in the next 2 years. Moving then to Qatar, there is a small amount of installed renewable capacity at the moment, but the significant program in Qatar is the recently announced Karama project, and the project documents or the RFP was released earlier this year, and that's a significant project that will be in the range of 500 to 700 megawatts. And then they've also announced further upcoming projects to come into play in the future. Moving from Qatar to Saudi, the two significant projects that have been procured in Saudi are obviously Sakaka on the solar side and Daj Wind on the wind side. And then we have the recent announcements by Repto for the a number of solar projects, 11 solar projects and more wind projects. So everybody's now waiting for further detail on those projects. And there's obviously been the expression of interest that closes tomorrow on the that Repto announced. So interested parties need to get back to Repto by tomorrow with their expression of interest on those projects in Saudi. We then turn our attention to Tunisia. There is a limited amount of installed renewable capacity in Tunisia at the moment. They've obviously announced large tenders to bring into play more solar and wind projects. So there are projects currently being procured, as you can see from the slide there, and they are a good size on the wind and the solar side of things. You've then got projects that are currently being procured in Tunisia, and then there are also projects that have been announced that are up and coming, and those are set out also on the slide in front of you now, which is solar PV, there's CSP, and there's some hydro projects as well. And then turning to the final slide, which is on the UAE. And the main focus in the UAE has been on the solar side of things. So there's procured projects already in play that you can see there. but they are obviously the different phases of the Mohammed bin Rashid Solar Park in the UAE. There is then further projects being tendered, which is the Swayhan and Ewek tenders. And then there is the very recent announcements that were made for Abu Dhabi, with a very big solar target for Abu Dhabi. And there is also a 2030 target announced for Dubai. So as I say, that was a very high-level overview of the publicly procured projects in those 10 MENA regions. If you've got any comments or questions on that high-level overview, please do let us know. That was an overview of the publicly procured projects. It doesn't cover any private PPA or projects that are not publicly available for us to record that data. But hopefully that was useful to you. I'll now hand over to Brendan from PPA, who will talk us through some of the business case for private PPAs in the MENA region. Thank you, Brendan.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Ewan. So I hope you can see my screen. So my name is Brendan Cronin. I'm going to talk mainly about, as a counterpoint to you, and mainly about private PPAs and their prospects in the Middle East region. So just, I'll be very brief on PPA. We are I lead the management consulting division for the Middle East region. PPA Management Consulting, we are about 300 people. We specialize in energy. We do market analysis, regulation, and market design. We do a lot of strategy development work and transaction advisory on M&A. I won't spend very much time. I have a little bit of background to PPA, but in the interest of time, I think I will skip on and talk more about the trends in the region and also potential role of private PPAs. So, you know, it is clear, and it won't be a surprise to most of you for me to say that, you know, the price of wind and PV that we've seen in the region make them an extremely competitive proposition relative to other technology choices. And you can see that, you know, by quite a long way now, you know, these are on dollars per megawatt hour terms. They're in real money, so it's not directly comparable to tender prices. But, you know, we're now at a level where we're seeing both wind and PV costing little more than $20 per megawatt hour, you know, compared to, you know, conventional alternatives costing $40 plus per megawatt hour. And you know, there is a clear cost advantage for wind and PV, you know, and that cost advantage can potentially lead to large cost savings for the end consumer and electricity consumer. And the question now is, what is the best way to unlock those cost savings, and how does the region harness the rapid fall in costs that have been seen? The other trend that's relevant in the region is that subsidies have been removed on retail tariffs. They've been particularly being removed on industrial retail tariffs, which is actually a contrast to many other parts of the world, which tends to, you know, load more of the retail tariff in other regions tends to be lower for industry, higher for domestic consumers, because countries are concerned about keeping industry competitive. Whereas in the Middle East region, there is a contrast where, you know, industrial tariffs have had subsidies removed and prices have increased. And now, you know, if you look at the chart, you can see that, you know, in many parts of the region, the industrial price of electricity is more than in a country, say, for example, like the USA. So it's not clear that energy and electricity is cheap, certainly for industry. And that is a trend that is making kind of industrial consumers of energy look more closely at how they can manage those costs. You know, if you combine those two trends, you can see that the business case, you know, for PV and privately procured PV, by which I mean, you know, PV that is, you know, directly contracted by an end consumer rather than by the single buyer, that case is very compelling. I've just shown the numbers here for Oman, which has some, is quite transparent in its data and actually breaks down generation, transmission, and distribution in its industrial tariff. And you can see that, the industrial tariff is, well over $70 a megawatt hour, and you could compare that to, very roughly, for an industrial ground-mounted site, maybe $30-ish a megawatt hour. Rooftop will be more expensive, but still is likely to be well below the industrial tariff in Oman. And that has led to a lot of interest in, how can industry start to directly kind of take advantage of the low solar prices that are seen. The final thing I'd say in kind of broader trends, I think centralized tenders and Ewan's laid out very nicely that the activity that's going on in centralized tenders, and that will continue and be the primary route to procuring renewables, undoubtedly. But centralized tenders deliver excellent tariffs, levelized cost of energy, but at the same time they're extremely time intensive to run, and countries have been unable to run multiple tenders at the same time, or certainly if they've tried to do that, they've experienced delays. And sole reliance, and you can see this when you look at the regional trends, and I wouldn't suggest that this is the only trend, but one factor, the only reason, but one factor why the Middle East lags behind Europe and America and other parts of the world in the penetration of wind and solar is that there isn't a way for the private sector to directly connect to the network and directly sell to end consumers. There has to be a tender that's run by a government institution, and there's a limited amount of people that can do that, and there therefore tends to be a bit of a bottleneck. And one interesting possibility is that private PPAs could be used as a way to unlock these savings that are now there and bring forward additional capacity in addition to the centralized tenders more quickly. So just a little bit more on private PPAs, what they are and what's happening elsewhere in the world and what the issues might be in the MENA region. So what do I mean by a private PPA? So it's a structure by a PPA that is directly with the end consumer rather than through a single buyer or through another government agency. So just on the left-hand side, you can see the structure that many of you will be familiar with. The single buyer runs a tender, procures a project, and then the power is sold at a bulk supply tariff onto either a distribution company, or there may not be a bulk supply tariff, it might be sold directly to the end consumer. With a private PPA, there's different ways that it can be done. I think John Pascal will talk a little bit more about it, but this is an example. There's a PPA directly between the developer and the consumer, and the power is moved over the network, and typically the developer pays a wheeling charge to use the network, and then there is not a direct match between the consumption of the consumer and the developer, so there is still a need for the net requirement to be sold to from the distribution company to the consumer, and there needs to be a framework that allows that to happen. So internationally, private PPAs have really been a huge growth area, particularly in Europe and America, but also increasingly in other parts of the world. So you can see on the chart that particularly the last 3 or 4 years, the volume has grown dramatically. There's a couple of reasons for that. On the kind of supplier developer side, developers have been facing a situation where subsidies for renewables are no longer there, and direct contracts from the government are no longer there. But in combination with that, falling costs makes unsubsidized projects possible. So it's now possible for a developer to, in some parts of the world, to deliver a project that doesn't rely on a direct government payment. And on the consumer side, there is large companies, particularly tech and telecoms, but also others, have corporate sustainability targets, just things like the RE100 that where companies have signed up to be carbon neutral, and they need to deliver that by procuring renewable energy. So there's a desire for large consumers to procure directly from developers. And you put both of those combinations together and you've seen a real development in the market elsewhere in the world. And it's been an area of significant interest for Poiri, and we're doing quite a number of projects in Europe, but also, as I said, in Asia, in America. It's also being talked about in places like South Africa, also. And just to say that there is a move in the region towards greater private sector participation. I won't go through this table in detail, but there is a firm move towards the IPP model in the region, and most countries, if not all countries, have firmly adopted that model. Certain parts of the region are going further than that. Oman is in the process of developing a wholesale electricity market that will go live in 2020. ECRA in Saudi Arabia are studying options for opening of the wholesale electricity market there. The GCCA, I know, are also very keen on a wholesale market, both for trading between countries, but also in the longer term for trading between participants in those countries. But another, component or option for private participation is to facilitate private PPAs in the region, and we're not just talking about the future here. It is actually there is actually markets within the region that have actually done private PPAs. I think Jordan is the prime example of that. Jordan has had wheeling and net metering for some time now. It's also possible in Egypt and Morocco. I think elsewhere, the GCC markets have not been as active to date, but there are signs that may be changing. Saudi Arabia is expecting to publish some regulations on rooftop solar that may facilitate this. But in general, I think this is a trend internationally, and a trend that I think more people are starting to talk about having applicability to the Middle East region. My final slide is just to say that there is while there is a saving and there is a large potential for private PPAs to bring forward cost saving, particularly for industrial companies, it needs a firm set of a firm regulatory framework. The markets in the Middle East are traditionally single buyer markets where all power, in some cases by law, must be procured by the single buyer, and there needs to be a bypass allowance for private PPAs to be able to bypass the single buyer. I think particularly talking here about renewable projects rather than conventional projects. Conventional projects will highly likely to still be procured directly, but the potential for renewable projects to bypass the single buyer and contract directly with end consumers is, as I said, a trend elsewhere in the world, and also is starting to be seen here in the region. And the reason for that are large consumers that have corporate sustainability targets. They have increased energy costs and are looking for ways to reduce those, and renewables are an obvious way to do that. I think then we need third-party grid and land access, and I think we need the regulations in place to allow direct purchase and allow wheeling. I think one issue and one area of potential reluctance is a perception that private PPAs could strand. Single buyers need revenues from retail customers to pay for the long-term contracts for conventional investments, and there could be a perception that private PPAs could reduce the ability of single buyers, reduce the revenue that ultimately flows to single buyers. But I think we're talking here about other parts of the world are talking about renewables, not conventional, and it would still be a small part of a bigger picture that is where there's still centralized tenders. But I think that is definitely an area of that would need to be balanced. There can't be wholesale opening for everyone and no revenue flowing to the single buyer. So there were my thoughts on private PPAs. I think I'm now going to hand over to Jean-Pascal from Evershed. He's going to talk in a bit more detail about the structures that are used in private PPAs.
Okay, thank you very much, Brendan. Yes, I'm just going to go through in slightly more detail the different types of PPAs we're seeing in the region, and just expanding on the underlying regulations applying to those PPAs. So initially, this slide describes the analysis we carry out for each new market. And this enables you to work out whether you go for the utility PPA or the corporate PPA. So some examples are, if there's delays in the utility PPA or feed-in tariff program, that will move you more to the corporate side. As Brendan mentioned, there's also the question whether the retail pricing is being subsidized or not. So we're seeing big reductions in the electricity retail price and the diesel prices, a big reduction in the subsidy for electricity retail prices and diesel prices in Saudi and Egypt. And as a result, there's a big focus on those countries for corporate PPAs. Another issue we'd look at is whether the off-taker, the utility off-taker, is creditworthy. Now, that's not so much of an issue in the region. That has been more of an issue in sub-Saharan Africa. So just looking at the different types of PPAs, essentially we've got, the standard PPA starting on the left is the PPA exporting electricity to grid, to utility. Then there's exporting electricity to a corporate via the grid network. The third box is looking at an on-site, so rooftop, solar farm, or a private wire solar farm, or even a wind farm. The last category of virtual PPAs, that only really works where there's a wholesale market, so limited opportunity in that respect in the region as yet. You can have a mixture of different PPAs, so predominantly the middle two boxes. You can do a mixture of on-site supply to a customer and then export the surplus to the grid. So just breaking that down, looking at on-site and private wire PPA. So here the generator will supply essentially all their output to the customer, the corporate, and the corporate exports any surplus to the grid. We generally have these on a take or pay basis. And one of the key issues for this type of structure is that if the corporate defaults, is there the opportunity for the generator to export to the grid. Now in the region, generally there is not the capability for the generator to export independently of the customer to the grid. So that's one of the issues in the region. Another question is whether you have, if you're looking at rooftop solar, for example, whether you have a lease, a property lease, or whether you have a contractual license. Now, this is a big issue in other jurisdictions where you are able to export to the grid. But if you're not able to export to the grid, at least does give you protection in relation to the insolvency of the customer. But if the customer goes insolvent, you haven't got anyone to supply to. So sometimes people take consideration that whilst the lease gives you a lot more protection, it's not worth the extra trouble because you're still reliant on having a customer, as it were. So looking at net metering, here the generator exports its power to the customer, and the customer will essentially export any surplus to the grid, and that export is offset against its imports. And that set off, or that netting off, is essentially carried forward for future surpluses, as it were. So taking two examples, the Kingdom Saudi Arabia have got net metering regulations, and so has Egypt, but they both have capacity restrictions. So the Kingdom has 2 megawatt capacity restriction, and Egypt has 20 megawatts. You can always install greater than the capacity, but you can only subject, taking Saudi for example, you can only subject 2 megawatts to a net metering arrangement. Generally, we find with net metering regulations in the region, the net metering agreement is usually a modification of the connection agreement between the customer and the grid network operator. And accordingly, there's no opportunity for the generator to carry out net metering itself. Most regulations, it only enables the customer to do so. So other examples of net metering is obviously Dubai. Bahrain is looking at net metering, and also Tunisia has net metering as well. So the other structure for corporate PPAs is wheeling. So here the generator either supplies the customer directly via private wire, and then the customer exports excess via the grid network to another site, or the generator will export straight to the grid network and wheel the electricity to the customer's site. Again, these tend to be the agreement, the key agreement, the wheeling agreement tends to be a modification to the connection agreement. So that will be both on the export side, on the import side. And the grid network operator will charge what's called a wheeling charge, and also adjust the output to take into account line loss factors. You've got to be careful that in certain jurisdictions, it's difficult to move across different networks, for example, between a distribution and transmission network. And in certain jurisdictions, they've yet to work out exactly what the documentation will look like and what the wheeling charges are. So examples of countries where there's wheeling, Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia are examples of where there's wheeling regulations. So looking at it from the point of view of a corporate customer, these are the types of issues, that will be a challenge for themselves. The first is the long-term nature of a corporate PPA, and generally you're looking at 15 years. See, corporates don't like signing such long-term agreements, and linked to that, they don't necessarily know if it's a private wire PPA. They don't necessarily know whether they'll be at that site in 15 years' time, and they don't necessarily know their consumption requirements at that site. Also, if it's a private wire PPA, the supply might not, more often than not, will not be consistent with their demand profile. And that's where batteries come into their own. As I previously explained, with corporate PPAs, because usually there's not a contingency, if the customer defaults, you can't then export to the grid. As a result, termination liabilities under corporate PPAs tend to be very high indeed, i.e. the developer will be seeking to recover all its costs. It's a fundamental requirement of a corporate PPA that the customer takes change in law risk. Again, it may be an issue that a corporate's not used to taking, but given that we're looking at new markets and markets where, as Brendan explained, there is unbundling taking place, so there will be a regulatory change. So it's quite fundamental that change in law risk is covered. So generator contingency is the point I raised earlier. What happens if the generator defaults? Is there any other contingency? If you can't export to the grid, then there's a question, can you supply to anyone else? The corporates, depending on the type of corporates, but definitely the international companies, so the likes of Vodafone and PepsiCo who are active in the region, would definitely be looking at getting the renewable benefits of that PPA. So one of the questions they'll be seeking, we'll be looking at, are there renewable energy certificates they can get their hands on? If not, they would want the PPA to confirm that they will get the renewable energy benefits under that PPA. With dealing with corporates, especially private wire structures, you've got to remember that you're dealing with a corporate who's got an operational factory on that site, so they'll be very concerned about keeping liberty to do what they want on that site, and for example roof maintenance and potential redevelopment of that site. Probably one of the biggest issues with corporate PPAs, especially when there's no contingency, is the creditworthiness of that company. Essentially, as a developer, you'll be wanting to have some sort of credit support in case the customer defaults. And just moving on to the general, flipping around, so looking at from the developer points of view, the types of issues they would look at. As we just discussed in the previous slide, the customer will want to retain certain rights to carry out property operations. So that could be roof maintenance, could be access to the roof. So what happens in terms of the loss of revenue and the cost of removing panels when the customer wants to gain access to the roof. Generally in the region, there isn't what we call the right of light concept. So there's nothing, depends on the jurisdiction, but one of the things to look at is, can you stop a neighbor building a skyscraper or a tall building shadowing the building you've installed the PV? As I explained, change law risk is a fundamental risk that you would seek to be protected. Grid capacity does tend to be an issue. So if you take Jordan, for example, that had a very large rollout of net metering wheeling projects, but now it's slowed down due to inadequate grid capacity on the network. On termination, you will be seeking to be kept whole. And that all links to, again, as I discussed earlier, creditworthiness. So you would want to ensure that even if the customer's creditworthy on day one, because it's such a long-term agreement, you'd wish there to be triggers in case their credit rating dropped at a later date. So different types of credit support tend to be, most countries you can have a parent company guarantee or letter of credit, and in some countries you can also have what's called promissory notes. So, for example, in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. One point I should have added to both lists, this list and the previous slide, is currency exchange rate risk. So most customers only wish to pay in local currency. So obviously that creates quite a big exchange rate risk. And that's been a very live issue in countries such as Egypt and Jordan. Whenever you look at a country, as Brendan was hinting, you need to look at not only the underlying regulations relating to net metering and wheeling, for example, but also you have to look at licensing regime. So most countries now do have regulations stating whether you require a supply license or distribution license or a generation license, for example. So the licensing regime needs to be checked for each country. So by way of examples, in Dubai, you're not allowed to supply electricity to a customer. You can self-generate, but you can't supply electricity. So for that reason, in Dubai, it's not a PPA as such. There, the developer would enter into an equipment lease with the customer. In Jordan, likewise, there wasn't the ability to supply electricity, but a decision was issued essentially providing a carve-out in that respect. You also have to determine whether you you require a generation license. There's quite often thresholds as to at what stage you want, what capacity of generation license is required. And similarly, sometimes, even though you require a generation license, there may not be a fee if you're below a certain threshold. So taking, for example, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, there recently have been some tenders from dairy companies, and they've sized their projects at below 30 megawatts, especially to avoid license fees being payable. In certain jurisdictions, you also need accreditations. So, for example, in the Kingdom, you need to be a certified contractor, and there also the works have to be signed off by the distribution company, so SEC. And there are also a number of other regulations more to do with carrying out business in certain jurisdictions. So, for example, setting up an SPV and construction works or environmental approvals. Lastly, as Brendan mentioned, you would look at ideally having some sort of property lease or usufruct agreement. One of the considerations you look at is whether it's what the land registry is like, i.e. can you, even if you've got a lease, does it provide you with protection? Different jurisdictions have different levels of comfort in terms of a land registry. We just on the lease itself, we in relation to rooftop, we had devised in the UK what's called a lease of the airspace above the roof. That's to avoid having any responsibility for the roof. We've looked at developing that in the region, and so far it's proven to be difficult. So instead of an airspace lease, it'd be most likely be a rooftop lease. So just bringing to the fore battery storage. So as I mentioned earlier, if you're looking at off-grid projects, then you're essentially replacing diesel generators with renewables. And then obviously there's an issue of matching supply of demand profiles. So we're seeing a number of off-grid solutions where essentially the developer there is taking over the diesel, installing solar and battery, and then coordinating the total amount. Another reason for installing storage is if there are grid capacity issues, or even net metering or export restrictions. I've raised the question: is there potential to generate additional revenues? A number of markets are looking at different regimes to tackle storage. So I think everyone's aware of the Jordan tender. So I think it's early days, but definitely will help where you're combining renewables with batteries. Just looking at some hybrid solutions or some developments. So this is desalination is obviously not just aimed at corporate, but we're seeing a number of desalination plants where there's multiple different technologies being installed. Data centers, another one. We're seeing a big increase in the rollout of data centers, given the amount of data and traffic and security in relation thereto. And data centers obviously are a number of the data centers are being managed or contracted by the huge IT companies like Amazon. And most of those want green energy. But I mentioned off-grid solutions, batteries, and not so probably relevant to the region. We're seeing it more in other areas. Island projects, you'll have self-contained grids, so you'll be supplying, taking over existing assets, installing renewable assets, and then installing batteries as well. So the last slide is just, I think as Brendan mentioned, there is the RE100. So all these companies have signed up to 100% renewable energy targets. A number of these countries are active in the region. In fact, the number is far higher than 100 now. We're probably looking at in excess of 150 and growing all the time. There's a number of international companies also that, whilst not joining the RE100, they are mirroring the targets under the RE100. So I think in the region, we're seeing probably a mixture of international companies on this list, but also local companies as well. Obviously local companies, then there'll be a question mark on potential question mark on creditworthiness. But we've seen probably in terms of the numbers between international and local companies, we're probably seeing more local companies entering into corporate PPAs in the region. So that ends my slide presentation. If I can hand back to Ewan to chair any questions.
Hi, thank you very much to you, John Pascal, for that overview of the PPA structures in more detail. Thanks also to Brendan for his overview of the more of the business case analysis of why corporate PPAs will have already played a significant role in this region and will continue to do so in the future. I don't know, Reese, I think, who's organising the webinar, was going to publish the results, or try to publish the results of the poll that we ran at the start of this session. I don't know if that's possible. Yes, it is. Yep. So Reese has shared that with us here, which is, this was the view of people at the start of this webinar, which was interesting. I think the correct answer is Egypt, and then Morocco, and then Jordan, in that order. I think Saudi have made, yet again, extremely ambitious targets for their clean energy, as has the UAE. So I'm sure both of those will catch up with the other three mentioned on the slide. But at the moment, from an installed capacity, it's not as set out on that slide. And Egypt, Morocco, and Jordan have higher installed capacity. I don't know, Reese, if there are any questions from any of the participants. I know we've literally got a few minutes left. I can't see any on my screen.
Yeah, we have got a few questions coming in, you, and I could just I open them up to the floor and the panelists to discuss. There's one coming in. We've only got 5 or 6 minutes, so I think we've got time for a few. But Ian's sent a question in, quick one. I think this sort of covers on what Jean Pascal was talking about. Is, have there been any good solutions globally or in the region for mitigating the exchange rate risks when it comes to private PPAs?
That's a very good question, and that is a big point we're looking at. We have had discussions with the EBRD about this to see whether they can support in any way. Some jurisdictions, we've asked the help of the central bank in that jurisdiction. They've shown positive vibes, but I don't think any of them have gone the next step, as it were. I know in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, people have looked at being paid in commodities rather than currency. So yes, lots of imaginative ways, but I don't think anyone's got the magic solution as yet.
Okay, great. I think we've got time for one more as well. Monya's sent a question in. Are you seeing a lot of interest from financiers and lenders to be involved in the private PPA space in the region?
Yes, we're seeing an enormous amount of interest. We've done projects of EBRD in Jordan again. I think, yeah, the funders are definitely very interested. But it all goes back to, the recurring themes are exchange rate risk and creditworthiness are the two big issues.
Okay, great. I think it's interesting to see that a lot of the questions are related to private PPAs, and there's a lot coming in now. But we'll have we've got why private PPAs in the region are only limited to 15 years usually.
That's the 15 years is purely a business case, financial model viability issue. So if you can get a payback earlier than 15 years, that's great. I think people are just using 15 years as, that's the model that's been used internationally to date. We're seeing some, I'm seeing a 10-year PPA and a 30-year PPA. at the moment. So it does show there is breadth, and you can go different ways. But the general period is 15 years, and that's purely financial modelling issue.
I think as well, it depends on the industry and the consumer. It depends how much visibility you have over your demand. If you think you're going to be here, after a certain point, you may wonder if you'll relocate or move your site to a different country or a different location within the country, and therefore you might not be willing to commit for longer than 15 years.
Yeah, it's an example of the 30-year that's a sewage works. So you can imagine they're reasonably comfortable. They'll be there for the long term.
Okay, great. And time for one more, sort of a different stance regarding Morocco, as it's currently exploring options for the unbundling of ONEE. What do you guys expect to be the outcome from the process? Or do you have any thoughts on the process?
I mean, the only thing I'd say on the Morocco side, I know that one of the issues has been the kind of the visibility on the wheeling charge that is used on projects there. And I think, if there's an unbundled kind of system operator and network owner, then, that should give more transparency on their costs, and maybe, a more structured kind of and more longer term view on the wheeling charge, or that is payable by developers.
Okay, great. Did Ewan or Jean-Pascal, did you have anything to add to any of the questions so far, or any comments regarding the webinar as a whole, as obviously we're looking to round up now?
No further comments from me on the questions. I think it's been extremely informative. I think the slides will be made available. Our contact details are then online and they're on the final deck of those slides, so you can get in touch with Brendan Poiri or John Pascal or myself with any further questions. But this is an area that has got huge potential for the region to grow what is already a very established sector in the clean energy market. And together with the publicly procured programs running in the MENA region, this sector, the private PPA, has got a huge part to play in the overall clean energy mix here in MENA.
That's great. Thanks again, Ewan, for leading the session, John Pascal for joining, and Brendan as well for your insight. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today, so we've got to wrap up there. But as I mentioned at the start, we're running this in conjunction with the MENA New Energy event in Dubai. We'll be looking to expand upon these discussions and a whole host more with over 80 expert speakers. So I'll be sending some info about that out with the slides and with the recordings as well. In terms of the questions that we didn't get to answer, I'll also be speaking with the panelists about the best way to work with that. So take a look at your inbox for next week, and we'll be getting back to you. But thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you.